Hello, everyone. Welcome to the fourth Sunday Showdown. Today we have Haz from Infrared and Lewis from Perspective Philosophy debating whether veganism is an ethical duty. A quick word about format and rules. Opening statements are 8 minutes long. Who goes first will be determined by a coin toss. I will warn you when you hit 5 minutes so you can wrap up, because when you hit 8, I cut you dead. This will be followed by 2 sets of alternating 5-minute responses, followed by 45 minutes of open discussion, and concluding with 20 minutes for audience questions. Regarding audience questions, Super Chats will be prioritized and asked in the order in which they appear. If we have time, non-Super Chat questions should be marked by an asterisk so I can quickly find them in the chat. Rules of conduct are strict. Speaking out of turn will result in 30 more seconds of speaking time being allotted to the other party, so save it for the response period or for the open discussion segment. The use of slurs or personal abuse will be met with an immediate ban, and this applies both to the audience and to our participants. If either participant attempts to talk over or challenge the moderator, being myself, during this debate, they will first be muted and warned, and then removed. I trust all this has been made clear, and that by participating, both guests, I will take at least to have tacitly agreed to the rules as just laid out. With that out of the way, we will flip a coin to see who goes first for opening statements. Haz your heads, Lewis your tails. Tails. Lewis, you go first. You are going to have 8 minutes for your opening statement, starting now.
Okay. Hi, everyone. All right. So, animals are inherently valuable. Consciousness is inherently valuable. And the inconsideration of sentient beings is inherently wrong. That is essentially what I'm going to be arguing when I say that veganism is an ethical obligation. An obligation is a duty or a responsibility. Now, I'm arguing from a Hegelian position, something that I know that Haz, at least tacitly, endorses, at least from what I've seen, he endorses. So hopefully we can make some headway there. So, all conscious beings have interests, desires, and the capacity to feel pain and pleasure. When we are considering conscious beings and conscious interests, we are considering what is the foundation of value and ethics as a whole. If we are to agree with the Hegelian position, then what we are understanding is that there is a right and a wrong entailed in the world itself. It's objective. It's not determined by you or me or any given party. It is something which is right, and that we can discover that it is right and then make it a law, make it a rule. I would say that we have already done such a thing. We already have laws, numerous laws, which protect the rights, the life, and liberty of individuals within the state, and usually humans. Of course, this wasn't always the case. The law used to protect classes of individuals particularly, and even still is inadequate in many cases to protect the overall interests of the general population, even humans, not just animals. Veganism is this consideration. Veganism is the consideration that animals are not being respected and treated equally in the eyes of the law, as in their interests, their desires, and their preferences are not being met with reasonable consideration. We aren't considering that the pain of an animal having its throat slit is not justified because we wish to eat them, because we wish to overpower them. We are considering ourselves more valuable simply based on an identity which we have constructed rather than something which is true by nature. If we are to be honest with ourselves and we are to be honest with the reality that we are spawned from, the unnecessary suffering of any conscious being defies what we are trying to do in ethics. That is express consciousness and subjectivity to the greatest overall possible degree, to create principles which genuinely reflect the interests and value.
One moment, I'm sorry, Lewis. Infrared, please no burgers in my window. Thank you. Keep going. You have 30 more seconds.
So when we consider animals and we consider their interests and their pain and their suffering, what we are doing is the same thing that we've done for hundreds of years. We are considering that the values that we hold today or have held in the past do not encompass the conscious interests of individuals throughout society. That, for example, Black people are not lesser, that women are not lesser, and now animals are not lesser just because of the identities that we have perpetuated upon them. And so when we consider the conscious interests of other sentient beings, we are being more ethical, more rational, and essentially doing the right thing. So I hope that explains my position.
And are you wrapping up?
Yeah.
All right, that was pretty fast. Okay, so let me reset the clock here. And you have 8 minutes for your opening statement, starting now.
So, in this debate, the main thesis I will defend is that Lewis, or perspective philosophy, plainly fails to grasp the principal significance of the Hegelian conception of ethics. Additionally, not only is his conception of ethics incompatible with Hegelian philosophy, so too are its actual contents relevant to this debate, namely veganism. Vegans like Mr. Lewis arrive, by means of conceptual abstraction, at the sweeping insight that mankind's current and past dietary habits are radically immoral and unethical. However, such a position of radical skepticism towards norms in the first place, the widespread popularity of which can be traced to the counterculture, is completely at odds with Hegel's view. It's a position which assumes that the content of morality can be arrived at ex nihilo, on the basis of an individually contrived standard of reason. Hegelian philosophy is rather one of reconciliation, one which endeavors to arrive at the deeper rationality of the world and its norms, whereupon the rational individual, who in Hegel's case is the modern Cartesian subject, discovers itself to be radically at odds with it, the definitive case being the newfound political anxiety provoked by the French Revolution for Europe's ancien regime. The content of tradition taken generally as the norms, customs, and culture of a given society obviously do change, but they do not change as a result of being imposed upon by what Hegel calls the law of the heart, or the frenzy of self-conceit. Veganism, taken both as an ethical obligation for the individual and a collective vision of transformation, rests upon the unhappy consciousness which affords recognition only of a contradiction between reality and this same individual self-conceit. Traditions change as a result of a radical process of mutual recognition between thinking beings, which animals could not possibly figure into. In the past, Lewis has contrasted the individualistic morality of Kant to Hegel's ethical life of state and society. While the distinction is superficially true, Lewis's conception of the Hegelian ethical life merely consists in an elevation of Kantian morality to the level of voluntary collective enterprise. His misreading of Hegel has its roots in a form of neo-Kantianism that has its origins in the late 19th century and spans from thinkers like Frederick Lang all the way to Habermas. Kant's principal error doesn't suddenly disappear when the same abstract and indeterminate morality shifts from the individual to collective level. The collective reality relevant to Hegel is not something voluntary but objective. It doesn't register some kind of common sight of radical skepticism or abstraction toward the world, but has as its content determinate relations which manifest a greater or supra-individual rationality, which Hegel's called Geist or spirit. It is only in the harmony between the individual will and the institutions of the state, which the individual forms a part, that the achievement of ethical life is possible. But the institutions of the state, for Hegel, are not determined voluntarily by the product of the individual use of reason. They are rather the form of civil society's self-consciousness, the contents of which being not their moral conscience, but their very being. Hegel's rejection of voluntarism and individual rationalism concerning the institutions of the state is best epitomized by his defense of the institution of monarchy. It is precisely on account of the pure contingency of the monarch's position, being inherited by tradition and completely outside the sphere of voluntary tradition by rational will, individual rational will, that Hegel defends constitutional monarchy as the site of a truly actualized freedom. Thus, from the Hegelian perspective, the answer to the question posed by the debate topic can be answered with a resounding no. The question is itself absurd. Duty to whom and for what? The Hegelian ethical life is not the product of any abstract or indeterminate duty, but the harmony between the determinate private interests of civil society with the determinate rights and duties imparted upon it by the state. There can be no real ethical duty, according to Hegel, that does not fit within this scheme. It is also peculiar that Lewis believes the Hegelian view would be favorable toward veganism, given Hegel's very clear distinction between humans and animals that renders any notion of animal rights an absurdity. Within Hegel's philosophy of nature, it is precisely spirit or Geist that distinguishes mankind from the animal kingdom. In that work, Hegel details that an animal is defined by the pure immediacy of external contingencies, its own inner nature being among them. For Hegel, the animal can only exist as an immediate individuality. Its existence does not contain, quoting, the generality that defines it, but rather comes at its expense in the form of an unending and violent struggle for survival. Conversely, human beings exist in societies, civilizations, and states. The universality of their being does not strictly stand opposed to its actuality, but is rather indefinitely realized through it, which Hegel calls history itself. While vegans claim that such views are outdated according to natural science, Hegel's distinction stands the test of time at the more fundamental level. An animal cannot have rights and is qualitatively different from a human being. One could not be a consistent Hegelian without acknowledging as much.
Thank you very much. All right, so perspective philosophy, you're going to have 5 minutes to reply, starting now.
So that was actually really interesting. I was actually surprised, to be entirely honest with that, you actually know that much about Hegel. That was pretty decent. I mean, you're absolutely wrong about the idea of the Cartesian subject being the Hegelian subject. That's not entirely wrong. And I think thinkers like Zizek and Lacan would exemplify why that would not be the case. In fact, the Cartesian subject implies some sort of inherent knowledge, an inherent self-understanding, which is absolutely absent within the Hegelian dialectic. In fact, self-understanding is the middle term, whilst the first term is consciousness. So, no, you're wrong about that. But otherwise, that was actually pretty decent. I am not actually arguing for veganism ex nihilo. I'm not arguing it from an abstraction that we are dismissing all of the ethics that has come before us. In fact, I see it as a rational development of the concept of equality that we have arrived to this place, and that's how I introduced my opening argument. I said that essentially we no longer consider other ethnicities, we no longer consider other genders as being lesser or weaker than us. Hegel did actually see animals as lesser. Hegel did, but Hegel was alive 200 something years ago, and really his ethics are, under his own system, outdated. He understood that ethics was a progressive system that was developing, and his understanding of animals was also underdeveloped, as his position on women. He thought women were lesser and inferior, just as he thinks that animals are lesser and inferior. And he also thought animals couldn't kill themselves. We know better now. So even in terms of raw psychological terms, we know that Hegel's philosophy did not capture the essence of an animal, which is unsurprising because it was 300 years out of date. Now, when we consider that, the concept of mutual recognition does not allow for the establishment of what is ethically right, but more the investigation of what is ethically right. Mutual recognition allows for the establishment of self-consciousness, which is the middle term in the Hegelian dialectic, which is infinite. The development of self-consciousness allows for the development of absolute spirit, which allows the individual to reconcile themselves with themselves. So you say, who am I considering when I'm considering the animal? I'm considering myself, because there is only the self understanding the self, whether that includes objects which are absent and nihilist in themselves and being determinate, are ultimately unified in what is the self. So even if I was considering an animal as in its consciousness, even without its self-consciousness, I'm considering me, because we are all united in spirit. That's the entire point. The consideration of consciousness itself does not need to recognize an individual's self-consciousness for them to have value. Children do not have self-consciousness. Babies, like before the mirror stage, and they are valuable. And so are disabled people. They have experiences which are inherently valuable, which we become conscious of. The whole point of self-consciousness is to become aware of the value which exists, which pre-exists self-consciousness, and construct an identity which allows for authenticity and freedom, which is the entire point of the Hegelian dialectic. Hegel's dialectic is 300 years out of date. We have now reached a point in which the concept of equality has developed past where Hegel was at that time. The Cartesian subject in this respect is absolutely non-existent. The subject is developing and moving past the point of an inherent or innate knowledge, which is trying to reconcile itself with. We are trying to reconcile ourselves with a logos, with something which is logically right within being. We are reconciling ourselves with what would be considered natural or with abstract right within reality. You say I'm talking about some sort of abstract terms. No, I'm not. I'm talking about the concrete definitions of equality and its application within our society today, what we are considering in that concept and why. The development of the Hegelian dialectic has brought us here, which is why philosophers such as Jeremy Bentham, Peter Singer, Thomas Regan, they are all developing upon concepts of equality and applying them to animals, which is why when Jeremy Bentham said,
Lewis.
Jeremy Bentham said, what is it that should trace the insuperable line? Is it the faculty of reason, or perhaps the faculty of discourse? But the full-grown horse or dog is by far a more communicable or rational animal than an infant of a week, a month, or a year old. Actually, a day, a week, or a month old. The question is, but if it were not, what would it avail? The question is not, can they reason, nor can they talk, but can they suffer? That is the question that we are asking ourselves today within the dialectic. And that is the question that leads us to a resounding yes upon the consideration of animals and their value. They matter, we should consider them, and we should protect them in law.
Thank you very much. Are you done?
I am.
Great. Okay. So Haz, you're going to get 5 minutes. Let me reset the clock. And
right.
You are good to start now.
So, right, unsurprisingly, you clearly don't know what you're talking about and fail to address any substantive point I raised. When I raised the point about the Cartesian/modern subject being relevant for Hegel, it is only insofar as this such subject is relevant for the entire enterprise of modern philosophy and modernity as a whole, including things like the French Revolution and so on. You mentioned people like Zizek and Lacan, but they were among the most ardent defenders of this very same insight. Obviously, Hegel goes far beyond the limits of Cartesian philosophy and what Descartes affords of the Cartesian subject, but it is still the same modern, abstract, and self-relating negativity of the Cartesian subject that modern philosophy as a whole must begin with, as well as the modern subject in general. Moreover, it's really interesting that you ground your view of animal rights in some notion of equality, which you disgustingly also apply to ethnic minorities and women, which are on the same level of animal, we should assume, equal. Well, this radical concept of equality comes and traces its origin in none other than Descartes himself. We can spar about that point later. Now, you say that when dealing with animals, you are considering the self. Yes, precisely. And that's why there's no dialectic process in which the other actually participates in that consideration. This is exactly why Hegel would describe it as an example of the law of the heart, or the frenzy of self-conceit, and all the perversions and narcissism corresponding to it. Now, Hegel being old doesn't actually address the meat and potatoes of the fundamental ontological distinction he's drawing between animals and humans. Just because it's from 300 years ago doesn't mean it's not fundamental to his philosophy, without which it becomes entirely meaningless. Now, you compared the extending of equality toward animals toward the extending of equality toward women and minorities. But the crucial piece of the puzzle you're missing there is the actual fact that minorities and women not only participated, but were the decisive factor in acquiring their own equality. They participated in a process, a dialectic and historical process of mutual self-recognition. Again, this is something that animals are not capable of doing. The only thing animals have going for them is people like Lewis who go on the internet and claim that we have to give them rights. Now, you mentioned children and disabled people. There's two prongs of why that's ridiculous. Children may not have self-consciousness, but there's no such thing as a species called children. Children are precisely the site in which self-consciousness develops. It's not a static object. Now, granted, disabled people may never develop a form of self-consciousness, but they represent, in the way we treat them the way we do in a good way, is because of the pure contingencies to which any individual may find themselves as a result of accidents of birth and other matters of chance. Ultimately, disabled people form a part of a human community. They come from humans and they form a part of our human society. Otherwise, the question of our obligations toward them wouldn't even be possible. Now, when I accuse you of engaging in a kind of abstraction, it seems like you don't know what I actually mean. I'm not doubting the fact that you fantasize about some process in which we all work together in this dialectic process to achieve veganism. What I'm actually talking about is that you counterpose some kind of product of the individual use of reason to arrive at an ethical or moral insight against the whole of the world and against the whole of society and the whole of tradition. While appealing to this alone would never possibly suffice, it completely betrays the Hegelian spirit, according to which evaluating a tradition and reality so entrenched as the consumption of meat should lead the individual to the path of reconciliation and understanding why this consumption of meat is so widespread, despite the fact that not everyone is supposedly as smart or intelligent as you. It completely betrays the spirit of Hegel. Finally, there's just the final thing. Ethics is, for Hegel, a site of statehood. Now, you interpret this to mean that we merely need to pass legislation to extend rights to animals. But again, the institutions of statehood and the laws therein are not a matter of voluntary determination according to the individual or collective, in the neo-Kantian way, moral conscience. The determinate content of society's institutions, according to Hegel, is the product of a deeper dialectic between the private interests of civil society and the rights and obligations, the rights and duties imposed upon them by the state, the contents of which can only fit within this scheme and within this harmony. You fail to demonstrate how veganism could possibly do that.
Thank you very much, and that's time. All right, Lewis, you're going to get another 5 minutes to respond. Let me reset the clock. Starting now.
Okay, so that was I appreciate why you say that. I do think I did actually respond. I don't think you picked up on it. And if the Cartesian subject was only brought up to recognize, the development of philosophy, then why didn't you mention, let's say, I don't know, the Freudian subject or something along those lines, and the ways in which we are balancing ourselves in relation to our desires, which would be more Hegelian. But whatever, if you think that it's philosophically relevant to explicate, is that right? Yeah, your position, that's fair enough. Okay, so where was I? Right. Okay, you said that I am arguing from what is a nihilistic abstract position now, and you saying that I am trying to propose some sort of methodology is really just an affirmation of a subjective consciousness trying to impose upon a notion of right from its own subjectivity, which would be what Hegel considers the irony of the subjective. I am not doing such a thing. I'm actually building upon the norms and traditions of our society, which has led us to this consideration. The concepts that I'm using are widely available. In fact, many of our society already engage in notions of welfareism and the consideration of animals and animal rights. We have laws in the UK which protect animals already, some of which have already been extended, and the UK has just recognized animals as sentient. Hegel also recognizes animals as sentient. Hegel also recognizes animals as conscious. He simply says that they cannot own themselves, so they are not capable of self-consciousness. That's unsurprising. They aren't rational, ethical agents. But this does not give us the right to them. It does not give us the right to dismiss the fundamental rationality which is imbued within what they are. That is not something that Hegel necessarily dictates. He says they have no right to life and so on like that. Of course he does. It's in his interest. He also says women, who knows how they get educated? And that's why I brought it up. I'm saying Hegel is wrong on some things, and he himself admits that he can be wrong. In terms of animals, yes, he is wrong. He admits they're conscious. He admits they're sentient. He admits that they have interests. He just basically says that they're incapable of knowing those interests, not that we are incapable of knowing those interests. He points towards subjects which are valuable, but dismisses their value since they cannot become aware of it externally from their experiences within reality. He is dismissing an aspect of consciousness because it cannot become aware of itself. Just because it cannot become aware of itself does not mean that it is not positioned within the Hegelian dialectic. The Hegelian dialectic starts at consciousness and then moves to self-consciousness as the middle term. The infinite middle term, which is the conscious reevaluation of itself, has what has led us here. The vegan as an identity, the identity of the animal lover, the carer of animals, those individuals who see themselves as guardians and not persecutors of other conscious beings, have a much greater consideration of consciousness than an individual who is not considering those interests. They are considering interests of an animal who does communicate their interests to us. And actually the funny thing is it is the necessary communication which would have had to have happened to allow the Hegelian dialectic to even form, to produce self-consciousness, which is something recognized by thinkers such as Emmanuel Levinas when he talks about the resistance of the face, of the ethics of the face, and the primordial resistance, which is necessary for language, which establishes the negation required for determinate objectivity and the production of words. So without this non-linguistic communication, which can be seen within the animal, we would not be capable of producing the middle terms necessary for the Hegelian dialectic to form. So no, I am actually responding to quote unquote the meat and potatoes of your argument.
1 more minute, Lewis.
That it's fundamentally wrong. The reality of the situation is, yes, Hegel makes a metaphysical distinction between animals and humans, but only so far as they are not self-conscious. That does not mean they are not conscious. It does not mean that they are not considered within the dialectical process. In fact, they are fundamental and integral to it. The understanding of spirit as being one in itself with consciousness as indiscernible from consciousness, which is the words he uses in the science of logic, mean that we cannot dismiss any consciousness which exists in nature, which means we are bound by the laws by the laws of right, which pre-exist our consciousness of them. Hegel was unconscious of them. We have become conscious of them.
Thank you very much. Let me reset the clock. And you have one final 5-minute response.
Yeah, it wasn't only the development of philosophy, Lewis. The modern subject proper begins with Descartes. This isn't a controversial view. It's the view of Zizek and Lacan. People you yourself mentioned, embarrassingly. The Freudian subject doesn't enter the picture until hundreds of years later. So yes, the modern subject and the Cartesian subject are more or less interchangeable for people who actually know what they're talking about and aren't grad students. Now, you claim to be building upon the norms and traditions of our society. What do you actually have to show for it? There is no imminent development of the phenomena of veganism among the broad strata of the people. It's only a tiny minority of overly socialized and overly urbanized people, precisely the demographic that, as a logical consequence of Hegel's view, would be susceptible to this same frenzy of self-conceit and the unhappy consciousness that propagate this cult of veganism. It's not actually gaining traction in the very roots of our society. And there's a very clear reason for that, which you're not addressing. Animals cannot participate in the process of mutual recognition. It doesn't. Now, the fact that animals do not possess self-consciousness doesn't give us a right to them. But here's the thing. Rights do not factor in this equation whatsoever, because rights are determinate things that are granted by the institutions of the state, not things that come out of thin air. Rights simply don't factor into the question of the treatment of animals. The custom, mores, and traditions of society do, which Hegel doesn't believe you can overturn or treat as completely treat in a way completely from scratch from the perspective of philosophy. Hegel doesn't actually seek to annihilate things like tradition, norms, culture, and religion by means of philosophy. Hegel's philosophy is meant to be reconciled with those things. The deeper question of the reality of those things is left later for other thinkers. The fact that it cannot become aware of itself means that it could not possibly elevate itself to the status of a subject, which can be, hold on, fuck me, god damn it. I'm sorry, guys. Don't fucking, I need to turn off alerts. Can you give me more time? Can you give me more time?
I'll give you 20 seconds.
This is fucking goddamn shit, man. Fuck my life. 2 hours of fucking goddamn. Okay. Now, it could not. The fact that it can't be aware of itself means it couldn't be elevated to the status of a subject that could be afforded rights or recognition in the first place for the ethical state or within the scheme of the ethical life. That would be just as absurd as imposing duties upon animals as well. Hegel is very clear that rights imposed upon the rights given to the individual are conditioned also by their duties and vice versa. Now, obviously, there's some kind of connection between humans and animals. And Hegel makes that very clear. But actually, animals are not capable of language proper in any meaningful sense. Language for Hegel does not simply mean the display of some kind of communication. This still fits within Hegel's description of animals are only capable of being acted upon by pure externalities. The communication by other members of the species being among those externalities. Language is precisely premised by self-consciousness and the radical alienation between a being and its own essence, the very radical alienation that renders the subject's relationship to themselves, the self-conscious subject, not only an immediate one forced upon them by pure externalities. Now, you say that the laws of right pre-exist our consciousness for Hegel. That is true, but they don't exist in the either. They exist in the form of the state, which for Hegel is the realized form of humanity's self-consciousness. The laws of right are not to be found already existing somewhere outside of the imminent development of state and civil society. They pre-exist us, yes, but not in a way but only insofar as they are already mediated in the form of the institutions of the state.
Oh, you didn't even need extra time. Are you done?
Yeah, that's it.
Okay, fantastic. So we're going to move into open discussion. Just a heads up for people in the audience, if you want to ask questions, super chats, of course, will be prioritized, as I mentioned in the introduction. Otherwise, if you don't want to super chat a question, put an asterisk at the beginning and the end so I can find it in the chat. I can't promise we'll answer them all, but we'll do what we can. So I'm going to set the timer for 45 minutes. Again, just to review the rules quickly. No personal abuse, no insults, yada, yada, yada. I don't mind insinuations of bad faith, etc., because that can be part of a philosophical discussion, but try to keep it civil, and above all, do not argue with me if I interject, and give someone time to finish their point. Ready? Let's go.
Yeah, so would it be all right if I respond and then you can pick it apart and we can see?
Go ahead.
Yeah, cool. So you said that they're not subjects until they become and recognize themselves in terms of self-consciousness. I would absolutely disagree with that. I would make the distinction between an agent and a subject in that respect, which is something which fits really well in the Hegelian dialectic because of the development from consciousness to self-consciousness. You say that language presupposes self-consciousness. Quite the opposite. I would say that self-consciousness is the product of language, and I think that fits again in the Hegelian schemata. And Levinas describes this as being able to hover over our own existence. And this is primarily from the recognition, of each other as having a will or having interests and actions within the world which have separated consciousness, which is the beginning of, absolute spirit, right? The reality is that the substance of spirit was separated by action. The unified totality of spirit has been separated into individual instances of consciousness because we aren't aware of our universal nature. Now, the reason that we, when we do engage in recognition, we do gain a conception of rights. We do actually gain a conception of self understanding, and we do create civil society and the product of laws which allow us to emulate natural right. But natural right pre-exists even civil society. Hegel actually states the laws of right are also simply there. We have to become acquainted with them. In this way, the citizen has more firm or less hold of them than they are given to them, and our jurist also abides the same point. But there is a distinction. In the connection with laws of right and spirit, investigation is stirred up and our attention is turned to the fact of the laws. Because they are not different, not absolute, laws of right are established and handed down by men. The inner voice must necessarily collide or agree with them. Man cannot be limited to what is presented to him, but maintains that the standard of right within himself. He is subject to the necessity and the force of external authority. So he even says in that quote, we do hand down the laws of right, but we must collide or agree with them to develop them to correspond with the laws that are simply there, the natural laws which pre-exist us, the same as the natural laws of physics.
At all?
Yeah, I mean, other than the fact that I would mention that obviously these natural laws are the laws of consciousness and not self-consciousness, which is the awareness of those laws.
Oa has you're silent. You're muted.
Okay, yeah. I didn't say they aren't a subject. I said they are not a subject relevant for rights in the states. Obviously, Hegel makes it clear in his philosophy of nature that animals are some kind of subject, but they are not the subject relevant for rights, duties, and ethical obligations. Now, you say that animals hover over themselves and the world, but such a separation, namely the separation between the animal and the world as mediated by something like language, could never be proven. Hegel precisely claims the opposite about animals. Hegel claims that this very such separation that allows a subject to hover over the world, over themselves and the world, is not accomplished in the animal being. For the animal being, there is some kind of obvious separation, but it is not a separation that gives rise to self-consciousness or language. Now, natural right may pre-exist civil society, but you didn't actually hear what I said with any degree of precision. These natural rights are only mediated by the institutions and the state, which rules over civil society for Hegel. In other words, natural right does not first strike the individual moral consciousness like lightning and then come to determine civil society and the state. The laws of natural right develop in a manner that is not premised by the insights of individual reason or the individual moral consciousness. They develop through a rational process that is fundamentally supra-individual. Now, by super-individual, by the way, I don't just mean that individuals collaborate or agree upon certain rights and norms. I mean that it comes as a kind of cunning of reason at their expense, even in a way, and their expectations and so on and so on. So it's a completely irrelevant point, actually. I have 2 hours of sleep. I forgot what I was going to say. The grasp. Okay, I'll let you go. I forgot what I was going to say.
Yeah. Just to clear something up, I didn't say animals hovered over their own existence. I was saying that is how language allows for the development of self-consciousness. And in so much, I would agree that animals do not have that same self-consciousness and that notion of identity. They're not in the middle term in the Hegelian dialectic. They're in the first term of the dialectic. They're in the consciousness. There is something as well to say that you're right in saying that the law, the abstract rights are not, essentially imbued within us. They don't strike us like lightning, as you said. They're essentially developed and uncovered in relation to an examination of reality itself, of the self, understanding the self. But they are premised by the immediacy of consciousness. It is this investigation into ourselves, which is precisely what recognition is an aspect of. And what I'm arguing in that is that primordial expression, as Levinas says, would be the foundation of any and all notions of resistance which would be necessary for the negation of our will, is the foundation of self-consciousness that animals themselves display. And so without recognizing this display of will within animals, we are negating the very same display which has allowed us to develop the self-conscious the self-consciousness, which is the dialectical middle term within the Hegelian dialectic. So in other words, if we reject this conscious display of interests and value within animals, then we reject the same display our ancestors and our traditions contain epistemologically prior to their current mediation within civil society. We reject the traditions and their foundations which were produced from these individuals who recognized one another and decided to form civil society and create a notion of justice and fairness and consideration of each other within abstract right, which is an embodiment of laws of fairness which exist within reality itself.
Yeah, but this examination you're talking about isn't actually an enterprise that occurs at the level of the individual use of reason. The uncovering you're referring to precisely happens at a historical and not individual level. An individual doesn't simply examine this like Sherlock Holmes and then imposes their insights upon the whole of society. The examination happens in a way that is fundamentally supra-individual. And moreover, the results of the examination, in a sense, are already predetermined. I don't think you would disagree with that. But so then the burden rests upon White explains the unhappy consciousness of the vegan in their kind of the manner by which they seek to change the laws and impose their view and preach and so on and so on. Now, it's actually interesting because even if we take into consideration Hegel's view of slavery, which I would have disagreed with at the time, but for reasons different, I would also grant the underlying rationality for his position. Hegel even opposed a lot of the kind of abolitionist fervor in England and throughout Europe, which simply sought to abolish the institution of slavery. Hegel actually thought that slavery would be dissolved through some kind of gradual historical whatever process, which reflects Hegel's radical conservatism. Now, you could say that this is just because Hegel was an old guy and it was 300 years ago, but this is what is fundamental to Hegelian philosophy. Now, from a Marxist perspective, you could at the same time recognize that slavery dissolved by virtue of some kind of material development in the forces of production, and it would be kind of this similar insight as Hegel's. But ultimately, whether you're coming from a Marxist, materialist, or Hegelian perspective, this kind of, tyranny of frenzied self-conceit, which Hegel also critiques as present throughout the French Revolution, is not compatible with the Hegelian perspective. Now, you mentioned that I forgot what you said. It was something about animals representing a prior state of being that premises our very self-consciousness itself. I agree with that, but I find the view that the necessary conclusion this leads to is that we cannot eat animals. This would assume that the cultures of mankind treat in the rituals of animal slaughter and animal consumption animals only from the perspective of some kind of abstract dominating cogito, which does not recognize the determinate particularity of animals. But actually, if you investigate from the perspective of culture, the real rituals of animal slaughter and animal consumption, you can even explain them in that way. You can even explain them in terms of the way in which mankind or self-conscious beings relate to their antecedent premises themselves. You could even go so far as to say that this is even true for things like factory farming, which may appear as the quintessential example of this dominating cogito, which does not recognize the particularity of animals and simply treats it as a kind of raw material. But it does not actually succeed in doing that in actuality. And it does reflect, if there is something like that in factory farming. I guess I would say from the Marxist perspective, this is only insofar as it represents a deeper relation in our world today between mankind and itself, some kind of more fundamental estrangement between humanity and itself. But still, there is no reason to think that the recognition that the state of animal being is a necessary state that premises the very possibility of self-consciousness must lead us to the conclusion that animals cannot be eaten according to some abstract duty.
Well, I guess like the point I was making is that it's not necessarily an abstract duty, but really the first duty, and the only duty that really we are really engaged in. It is the essence of the will. Duty is the essence of the will. That duty is seen in animals, and that's what I'm trying to argue here. That when we consider animals being the fundament, as in like animal behavior as demonstrating desires and interests which exist externally to our own, we are essentially recognizing their power to negate our own interests. The difference is, in terms of mutual recognition, they can't recognize our power to negate their interests in the same way. They don't have the necessary faculties to form a language and a linguistic structure which allows for dyadic conceptions of themselves. They can't form the I. That doesn't mean that the relationship between us and animals does not necessitate our consideration of their will. It means that they are incapable of returning that consideration and forming civil society with us. And that civil society and that absence from civil society does not, which means they can't be given positive rights within our society in terms of, let's say, the right to vote or something like that. But it does not mean that we have the right to, undermine what we would consider necessary faculties. And I think this is why, for example, I would disagree with Hegel and say the consideration of slaves or people who even accept their slavery. And I think this is kind of Hegel's point. The slave enslaves themselves for Hegel. The slave has adopted the mentality of being slave-like and needs to almost fight their way out to develop a self-consciousness which is independent from the identity imposed by the lordsman. The bondsmen must work upon themselves. And I can see why he's arguing from that. I guess my disagreement would be there that the power structure from which we gain this self-consciousness, it necessarily does not mean that we should impose unfair power dynamics upon individuals so that they can develop freedom. Our consideration of their will is separate from their consideration of our will. So this is how mutual societies or mutually distinct societies or mutually distinct spirits in terms of abstract right would engage with each other until they form a coalescence within absolute spirit. The laws of one land versus the laws of another. Hegel recognizes that the laws of one land are superior to the laws of another and talks about the progress necessary within society to, essentially reach a more free society. Referencing his like historiography in his philosophy of history. This would mean that individuals in, let's say, Germany at the time that he was talking were obligated to treat other individuals from society that are external to Germany in a way that was considered ethical by their standard and not by the standard of those in an alternative society. So if a British person disagrees with slavery, then they ought to treat individuals as being equal and not enslave them. This would be a matter of actualizing the self-consciousness which exists within the state. This is exactly the same thing I would say about animals. When we recognize the consideration of animals as having this primordial will, which does not recognize itself, we still must consider its interests. We still must consider its value. And in that consideration of its value, we must find that although it cannot know the consequences of, let's say, ethical ignorance, that its ethical ignorance does not permit our ethical ignorance.
So, but the issue is that animals are not human. if there is an aspect of ourselves that is somehow common with the animal, it is a moment of a greater being of which we alone form a part. I think there's a confusion here between the view of the animal being a moment in the being of Geist or spirit for the human being, and from a broader kind of natural historical perspective of, like, for example, a kind of evolutionary view of the way in which animals develop and become human. These are entirely two different processes. Moreover, I think this perspective is radically not Hegelian. I don't think Hegel believes that animals are incapable of self-consciousness on account of some kind of pure contingency, like a person being disabled would. There's actually a reason why animals are not human. There is an inner kind of rationality of the animal being itself that makes sense so far from the perspective of the animal, not from the perspective, but taken at the level of the animal being, which makes sense and which reconciles some kind of deeper unity of opposites. Now, insofar as animals actually do figure in this moment of the premises of self-consciousness for the human being, it is so far as they are consumed, so far as they allow us to subsist and satisfy our own base animal necessities. It's very strange that the ways in which animals consume one another does not somehow figure for you in the fundamental being of the animal world in general. Now, Hegel's view regarding slavery is not actually prescriptive, but descriptive. He doesn't say this is what should happen per se, taken by itself. He says this is actually what happens. So when Hegel critique, and this is actually something that happens and has actually happened across history, conquered peoples become enslaved, and then this initiates some kind of dialectic process that produces real historical changes and outcomes. Hegel merely critiqued abolitionism because he thought it was a vain attempt to hover over this type of imminent development and this imminent process. He wasn't prescriptively saying that it should happen. It was happening for Hegel. Now, you say that Hegel requires individuals to treat others from different societies and states by their ethical standard, but the reasons for this contradict the conclusion that animals themselves should be treated in the same way, because, plainly put, animals don't have any ethical standard. Animals do not belong to a state or a civil society and do not obey any kind of abstract or alienated norms or institutions whatsoever. For Hegel, different societies enter into, moreover, a process, again, of mutual recognition and mutual development, where it's tit for tat. They both participate and develop in it. Animals aren't capable of that. Now, you talk about the fact that humans are obliged and have a duty to fulfill animal interests, but if animal interests, if they are intelligible, would be radically incompatible with veganism. There are some animals which, for physiological reasons, must consume and lead to the death of other animals. Even beyond then, the conclusion doesn't actually follow from the premise. Animal interests are in no way compatible with the obligations Hegel believes a given citizen of a state has toward another human being, which is part of another state and part of another community, or even just a random stranger who isn't part of any clear society or state. The difference for Hegel is that this kind of benefit of the doubt that can be afforded to the stranger, emptiness and lack of determination on the part of the stranger, contains and conceals an imminent potentiality to enter into the course of mutual recognition and being a part of some kind of bigger community.
Well, I guess this is where I would say that animals aren't human. Neither is the first term in the Hegelian dialectic, because humanity presupposes a form of identity which has not yet developed. Like, for example, like notions of humanity, even in like the history of philosophy, like seeing each other as, members of, like, what was it, like homogeneous, like of the same species. That didn't develop in terms of self-consciousness, even historically, until a certain point. And then in terms of individualism, which allows the individual to interact with their state in a way which is particular subject versus institutional obligations, which mediates the subjective freedom and the objective freedom of the state. That didn't even develop until like Hegel really come around. So like these notions in terms of the development of the dialectic weren't even present at the point of the inception. The point of the inception of the first premise of the dialectic is consciousness itself, the immanency and the foundation from which all reality is derived, which is like consciousness is all that's really being considered. And you said that, I think it was towards the start, you said that I wouldn't disagree that the end of history, as it would, like the end of the Hegelian dialectic, would be the same. Well, as an empty formulation in a Kantian sense, yeah, it wouldn't be the same. It would be absolute knowing or absolute spirit. But what that actually looks like, Hegel kind of leaves blank deliberately, because it's not something that we are actually entitled to know because of our historicity. And I don't know if you would disagree with that. In so much, I would say that Hegel would not have predicted the rise of veganism and the consideration of animals as the growing dialectical process. I think that it is the consideration of the conscious standard which pre-exists the logic that was developed within the dialectic. In the philosophy of, in the science of right, he goes so far as to say that, where is it? Let's see if I can find it. Second. One second there. Just lost it. It's on the genesis of logic, I do believe. Actually, I know where it is. I just realized I think it's page 45.
Okay, while he's doing that, for people in the audience who have questions, put an asterisk on the beginning and the end. We'll be doing audience questions in 20 minutes. Thank you.
Right. Okay, he says that here we may quote it from, like, this is from the Philosophical Sciences, his Encyclopedia of Philosophical Sciences, and he quotes himself saying, "There is nothing in heaven or nature or spirit or anywhere else that does not contain just as much immediacy as mediation, so that both these determinations prove to be unseparated and inseparable, and the opposition between them nothing real." So in spirit, there is no actual opposition. The negation of negation leads to the unity of being, which is the unity of self-consciousness and consciousness. Animals are an aspect of consciousness which we must become united with. And so with the development of the dialectical process, an inconsideration of a conscious being would be a lesser mediated and contradictory position within spirit. It would not be spirit as it is or should be. It would be spirit as seen how we would like it to be. And Hegel actually mentions this in the Philosophy of Right, where individuals come into conflict with the law itself, seeking to express what they think ought to be the case rather than what is the case. And he says that we need to essentially bend to the existence of value in nature or value in consciousness rather than the other way around.
Yeah, but regarding the first thing you said about the reason for the fact that the end of history or whatever is not, or the philosophy of right and so on, was not realized until very recently. Such changes, whatever we want to make of them, assuming we're operating from this strict Hegelian perspective, were not physiological or natural changes which they would have to be in the case of animals. I think, again, this is a kind of false, almost caricature of the Hegelian view, according to which there is this kind of linear progression between lower and higher forms of being. But for Hegel makes it quite clear that there is a reason why animals exist as animals, and it makes sense. Animals are not moments in, animals themselves are not moments in humanity's being. Humanity possesses an aspect within itself that is comparable to the animal being, but animals themselves, it's not. So the fact that for most of humanity's history, it did not achieve the kind of whatever you want to call it, I forgot which you were trying to say. It's all controversial stuff. Absolute knowing, the end of history, and so on and so on. This is not actually something that animals. This is something that was always already possible for human beings, given their physiological and natural presuppositions, given where they already stand within the philosophy of nature. This is not true for animals. And regarding this, as an aside, regarding the question of absolute knowing, yes, it's true that its contents are not transparently pre-established, but I think you're confusing what absolute knowing actually is. Absolute knowing will not consist in a position that's going to possess some kind of prescriptive stance toward what is truly what one really ought to do, and, like, for example, in terms of one's dietary habits and one's participation. All of these things for Hegel possess objectivity. They possess objectivity in the form of mores, customs, traditions, and so on and so on. The position of absolute knowing ends from the perspective of philosophy itself, namely the philosopher Hegel himself, the one who is cognizant of some kind of deeper harmony of history and being, and so on and so on. Regarding the thing you said about the unity of opposites and the implication of the relation to animals, I don't really think it's important to point out that for Hegel there are no true contradiction. It's only a matter of reconciliation, the negation of it. Yeah, it's not relevant to what I was saying, obviously, yeah. But regarding this kind of end state of the relation between humans and animals, again, the practice of the consumption of meat itself is just as compatible with this. Such a consumption affirms, on the one hand, the premises of self-consciousness, namely the need to satisfy physiological base animal instincts, and so on and so on. And on the other hand, affirms the self-consciousness as a higher moment of being above the animal kind. So the conclusion plainly doesn't follow that we can't consume meat. Just because, so I think you're making an error here. You're not taking note of a necessary distinction. Of course, animals within the greater fucking scheme form a part and premise the possibility of self-consciousness. This does not mean that we have an obligation to protect animals, because the manner by which this develops has already occurred. It already has occurred. It's something that has occurred imminently and is not the result of like you talk about the distinction between that the individual must bend to what is rather than what ought, right? But bending to what is, in this case, the actual and let's say real relationship between mankind and the animal world within Hegel's scheme, acting in such a way that is cognizant of what this is in no way implies that animals somehow have rights and cannot be eaten, and so on and so on. My argument is that the best argument for what this would look like is the very consumption of animals. It's the very consumption of animals that represents this acting in regards to what is. So, and that's why the consumption of meat across the cultures and history of mankind is laden with so much tradition, careful tradition, culture, and so on and so on. It can be even explained within this Hegelian scheme.
So yeah, like animals not being self-conscious is not what I'm saying. Like I do agree animals are not self-conscious. Animals are not the middle term. We're the middle term. We're the self-consciousness which is coming to know itself to develop into absolute spirit. That is the dialectical process, and it's been developing since the inception, which was from consciousness itself, all the way through to the development of absolute knowing, which is the unity of this middle term with the first term in the conclusion, which is absolute knowing. That's or absolute spirit, which contains absolute knowledge. That absolute knowledge is, as we say, like indeterminate and is non-contradictory in relationship to nature. Like no contradictions exist in nature, but the contradictions that exist within us are what are driving us forward in terms of the negation of negation, which is leading us to this absolute spirit. And so these contradictions are our awareness of the contradiction of the mediating term, ourselves, and nature. We are realizing that we ourselves have created identities which are inadequately describing the system of drives which pre-exists that identity. We are wrongly sublimating and engaging in our desires within society as to not allow for the greatest expression of subjectivity within this Hegelian dialectic, which is why the conception of a better and better society is the greater and greater expression of the system of drives. Animals are within the system of drives. They are simply not conscious of the system of drives. We are the mediating force. They are what we are. They are part of what we are mediating. They are subject to our ethics in our attempts to make sure that they live good lives. So for example, our consideration of animals. An animal might want to get like jabbed up or like some sort of vaccine, but we would do that to them regardless of their resistance, because they are not aware of the positives that would be affecting them in terms of the system of drives itself, because we are the self-consciousness. We are what determines the abstract notions of right from which determine our treatment to them. But we are what determine the contingent laws which are reflective of the immanent right, which is universal and necessary within consciousness. The consciousness itself contains immediate notions of right which we are not aware of. So the animals themselves and all conscious beings contain this logical necessity from which ontological necessity predating logic. Actually, in terms of the Hegelian dialectic, spirit is the necessary foundation for the production of logic, and in such the resistance that exists within animals is the necessary negation from which logic requires. We would have no notion of negation and the law of non-contradiction at all, or the notion of identity at all, without the negative force of an external will, which is essentially what Hegel's pointing to. So when we see an external will embodied in an animal form, if it cannot recognize us, it cannot form a dialectical relationship and form rules of abstract right. That is absolutely true. But being a conscious being, it is governed by those rules just as we are. We do not produce these notions of right and therefore determine and govern as we see fit based off our mutual power relationship with the other. The power relationship is actually an obscurity, really, which is preventing us from seeing reality in a way which is corrupted by our attempts to put our subjectivity over the objectivity of what we both share, which is the will. So when we look at the fact that an animal cannot engage in this power relationship or in a state of mutual recognition, it's not that the animal is not what we are recognizing. We actually must imminently recognize the animal to even have begun the dialectic, which is, I think you agreed to, like animals are conscious and we do recognize that they are conscious and feel pain and pleasure and so on. Animals simply do not recognize it themselves. We do recognize that consciousness and we do recognize it in the other, but we recognize as well that the rules that we have, the embodied traditions, are expressions of right that are embodied in consciousness itself within ourselves and the other. Animals do fulfill the mandate of being the other. They simply cannot fulfill that mandate within a dialectical process. They cannot continue they cannot continue and form a relationship which, you know, constitutes either a master-slave relationship or a constant conceptual development. They can't hold notions and concepts. We can, and we hold notions and concepts which embody them and give them meaning, just as much. Highlight or explicate the meaning that already exists within them. Their pain and pleasure is valuable in and of itself. We can know that. And meaning and has to be this way for Hegel. And I think, you know, thinkers such as Robert Brandom even talk about how the foundations of semantics have to be within reality itself. If we do not allow our words and our meanings to be given objective reality separate from this self-conscious mediation within the dialectic, they would lose grounding. It wouldn't actually make sense. There would be no unity between what is the mediating force of the middle term and consciousness itself, which again is why Hegel, which is why Hegel says that consciousness, or that that in spirit there is nothing unseparated and inseparable. They are
okay, Lewis, just try and wrap it up in the next 30 seconds because we're running out of time and I want to give Haz the last word. Okay, keep going.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. They are inseparable. The notions between consciousness and self-consciousness are unified in absolute knowing and absolute right. And this would give us the foundations for a perfect will. It would actually destroy subjectivity in terms of and unite it with objectivity. The subject would be inherently objective if they were a member of the community which engaged in a law which was absolutely perfect and absolutely correspondent to the law of right within nature.
Okay, so it seemed like you said a lot of extremely irrelevant things as to the actual debate and point at hand. I don't even know if we're going to have time to cover all of it, but I think I'm just going to try and simplify it. To put it simply, you are confusing philosophy of right with philosophy of nature. You're assuming that the philosophy of right is tasked with reproducing voluntarily the philosophy of nature, but this isn't true. Obviously, philosophy of nature is a premise of the possibility of philosophy of right. Put differently, obviously, nature is a premise of humanity and spirit and so on and so on. But this does not impose a duty or an ethical obligation on part of individuals to preserve this process in a manner outside of the self-preservation and self-realization of spirit itself. In other words, like I said, animals are not somehow on the ladder to becoming human agents, and we just have to cultivate them as an aspect of our being, and because they occupy the sphere of drives that whatever. But animals will always be animals. This is what you're not understanding. This is why you're confusing the two things. You're making a really crude kind of is-ought distinction, which is foreign to Hegel's position. You're effectively trying to say that because Hegel descriptively outlines some kind of place humanity has within the whole of nature, humanity then has an ethical obligation to fulfill this same premises. But as a matter of fact, these premises are fulfilled in a manner that is antecedent to right and manner antecedent to obligations. So it could not possibly be the case that it would be constitute right. Moreover, even if in some sense this is what happens, namely humanity must account for its premises, obviously outside of the sphere of ethics and right, since such a thing would not be possible. Hegel makes it very clear. Like if, for example, if Animals cannot form within the scheme of ethics and ethical life proper. We can just condense it that way. That is not our problem. That's the problem of nature itself. This is what is the result of nature itself. Superimposing some kind of duty to account for our natural premises beyond accounting for our determinate natural premises. For example, our need to survive and our need to satisfy our animal-based wants and so on, is completely foreign to the Hegelian scheme. We ourselves are, so far as we are concerned, this is a very important distinction. We ourselves, so far as we are concerned, are the only subject of ethics and rights and so on. Not ethics and rights, are only relevant in regard, I got 2 hours of sleep, in regards to our material premises. Now, you talk about the fact that we both agree that animals are conscious. I agree, but only in a very restricted Hegelian sense. Hegel, remember, is an idealist. What most people mean colloquially by consciousness is, in fact, self-consciousness. So I just want to point that out for the audience. Now, you say that attending to the wants or needs of animals it has to be this way on account of the very fact that animals comprise the kind of premises of thinking beings. But the manner by which animals comprise the premises of thinking beings happens in a way that is outside of the sphere of ethical duties of these same thinking beings. For example, Hegel does not actually speak of a right to food or things like that, even insofar as it concerns our subsistence. So it's a kind of ought-is distinction. We do reproduce our physiological premises that condition the necessity of self-consciousness, but we do so only insofar as it is a moment in the realization of spirit. We don't do so as a matter of imposing some kind of abstract duty upon the world and upon culture and society. Now, the crux, I wrote notes separately to remember what you were saying. The manner by which this unity of consciousness and self-consciousness you're talking about expresses itself imminently, not voluntarily. It doesn't express itself in a way that it doesn't express itself according to the voluntary will of the individual. It expresses itself in the form of the very determinate development of history itself. So this unity between self-consciousness and consciousness that you're talking about is something effectively already reconciled for Hegel. It's not the fact that we are not vegans means it's not reconciled. No, it is precisely reconciled. Moreover, I find it interesting that you neglect the wider point that why can't our cultural dietary practices of animal slaughter and consumption and so on, which have many cultural meaning and laden with depth and so on, why does this not, according to your view, accomplish this very same such unity? Why is it that the consumption of animals necessarily means that self-consciousness denies the premises, its own premises in the form of consciousness? Why could it not also mean that it affirms its premises in consciousness? After all, isn't that why, especially upon eating meat and people being brought together in a community to slaughter a cow or something or a goat, that they basically express their gratefulness, there's some kind of deep gratefulness that, in a sense, not much separates us from animals. But at the same time, something manages to. And this is both a very humbling and dignified experience. Both very humbling and very dignified, so far as our humanity is concerned.
All right, so we're running up to time.
That's it.
If you guys want to take 5 minutes before you go into questions to grab water or something, you've been here for a long time. So for anybody in the audience, if you want to ask questions, put them in asterisks. We'll go for about 15 or so minutes. I think we're not going to go too long. Our participants are extremely tired. And well, thank you very much. So we'll come back in 5 minutes. If you're both cool with that, you can go grab a drink or something, and then we'll get started on audience questions. Sound good?
Would Haz be okay with us just like just making a few points, just essentially just off what he said there?
Only if you let me interrupt you.
Yeah, that seems fair enough.
Okay, go
Within
ahead.
reason.
What
I
do you
mean,
wanna
like, don't like just interrupt like every 2 seconds or something, just so I don't like actually say something.
Okay, what do you
But
want
he has something to say. Yeah. So, Hegel doesn't outline humanity's place, like as in the beginning of the dialectic in his philosophy of nature. He does that in the phenomenology of spirit. This is the pre-philosophical work, really, in the sense that this outlines the ontological commitments necessary in philosophy for the development in the science of logic. So, and the beginning of this is consciousness. It's not the notion of humanity. So, humanity's place in nature is secondary to its place in the dialectic, which is
but the philosophy of nature outlines the process by which such a being, whose development is expressed in the philosophy of mind, is possible.
Somewhat. I think that Hegel's notions of nature are tentative, and I think that
For Hegel, at least, you may not agree with it, but for Hegel himself, this is true.
Oh, but for Hegel, it's certainly. Well, I would say that it's a good work. I don't think that he's necessary. I don't agree with everything it says, but that's separate. I don't think there is a confliction in nature in the sense that we are consuming them. I do think that we can satisfy our system of drives within a vegan society. We can sublimate our base drives and needs with a vegan diet, and we can live happy, healthy lives.
I'm not denying that that's possible, although I think I would argue that point. My point was that this is not the only manner by which this would be possible in the most consistent and full manner, in a way that is in harmony with the realization of spirit, basically.
I guess that's the point of contention, because I would say that the unity of dialectic is an ever-developing, not reconciled process between consciousness and self-consciousness.
But that's precisely why it's reconciled.
Well, it's reconciled in formal terms, but not in concrete, real terms. As in,
it is precisely reconciled.
No, I think that there is the confliction between the individual and themselves, which is why the development of spirit is never going.
The whole point for Hegel is that development is itself a concrete, something that is concretely reconciled.
In becoming, but it only is. It is only truly reconciled when it becomes unified absolutely with himself, which is the point of absolute spirit.
Which Hegel claims is accomplished in his own work.
Yes, but he also claims to say that it's reconciled. It's absolute spirit is an ever developing infinite, isn't it? The infinite is a constant.
Of course, it's ever developing, but for Hegel, that is precisely why it is reconciled at the same time. This development fits within the scheme of absolute knowledge itself.
Yeah, but it's
the contents of absolute knowledge are obviously not pre-written somewhere, but the development Hegel talks about is already reconciled in its form.
I think
whatever form it so happens to be, which Hegel is open about.
Yeah, but I would say that the absolute knowing is a development from the logic, which is also developing. So it's like, yes, Hegel recognizes that absolute knowing is dependent upon the philosophical forms that are available to us, but they themselves are developing. Logic itself is developing from epoch to epoch, from individual to individual in terms of the societal development.
For Hegel, his was the end. His was the accomplishment of absolute knowing. It was the culmination for this was the ambition and scope of Hegel's position. I know it's contended by many Hegelians, but I think these Hegelians are kind of chickening out as far as the actual audacity of Hegel's enterprise.
I don't think that. I mean, don't get me wrong. I do think that he's an audacious kind of guy. I don't think he's that audacious because he does say that the child of the next generation is superior to the genius of this
Well,
world.
I think what's being mistaken here is that for Hegel, the enterprise of philosophy is accomplished. This doesn't mean history itself is ended in the strict sense of like there will no longer be any development after this. Obviously, that's not Hegel's position. But so far as it concerns the ailment, Hegel considers there to be a fundamental ailment in the enterprise of philosophy. He considers this to be resolved in his specific
I would agree
sense.
with that. I would say that Hegel sees himself as resolving the conflictions in society, and particularly the mediation between the external and the internal world, which had plagued philosophy for like over 1,000 years. I would say
Okay,
that he
guys.
definitely saw that.
This is interesting. I'm going to set a timer for this for 10 minutes, then we're going to go into audience questions. Is that all right?
Yeah,
Do you guys
I'm
still
only-
want 5 minutes to like
Yeah, that's
whatever?
fine. I'm only just going to say one more thing, and then I'm happy to take the break.
Okay, cool. Go for it.
So yeah, I would say that you mentioned like the community bringing together to slaughter an animal as an act of unification within consciousness. I would say that the slaughter of the animal is the destruction of consciousness, in which an individual associates with a particular identity over the universality of consciousness and represents something like an in and out group that would be fundamental to what we see in underdeveloped notions of right, which Hegel points towards various cultures in his philosophy of history as having. And I would say that communities which engage in this, communal action are ignorant to the self-destructive process, which ultimately destroys their own self-consciousness. In its
Well, why is it a destruction of consciousness?
Because it's the inconsideration of another of consciousness in its of consciousness simpliciter of the
Why? Why
universality
is
of
that?
consciousness.
Why can it not also be an acknowledgement of consciousness simpliciter and its relation to us? I mean, for example, the animal kingdom is itself, like, I think there's a lot of confusion here. The animal kingdom itself is a site of extreme violence, or not violence proper, I guess, but it's a site of violence is an anthropomorphic term. Animals are eating each other and whatever, dying for no reason, and it's a brutal whatever thing. So eating an animal is, in a sense, acknowledging the actual reality of consciousness simpliciter. Actually, rejecting eating an animal, I think, would be this very same annihilation of consciousness simpliciter you're talking about. The annihilation of consciousness simpliciter is the rejection of the fact that there's a distinction between self-consciousness and consciousness. It's almost like there is really a imposition of whims that could only possibly result from self-consciousness or whims or moral conscience upon conscious beings. Like, you are superimposing a product of a strictly human perspective upon animals. But animals themselves don't really give a shit about any of that stuff. They don't. So when we eat an animal, we are, in a sense, acknowledging this fact of both the animal being and our own being.
I guess what I would say to that is that in the consciousness of the animal, do we still see the system of drives, which is why you say animals do like act on their own impulses, and Hegel recognizes that they act on their own impulses and are actually slaves to them. I don't disagree with that, but that precisely is why it must be mediated by us as self-consciousness, as being expressed to the greatest possible degree.
As forms of self-consciousness, we ourselves possess drives. We are not elevated above our drives to determine them voluntarily. We are still bounded by our own drives, and Hegel recognizes as much. It's why Hegel completely rejects the Kantian moral perspective, because for Hegel, the Kantian moral perspective is marked by what he calls the stamp of particularity. We are really given to our drives, whether we want to elevate ourselves above them voluntarily or not.
I do agree with that, actually. But that's precisely why we share the exact same primordial right as animals. The consciousness and the system.
But this is a right that was proven. This right was already proven in the fact that we human beings have history. The right was not proven so far as animals were concerned.
But the proof is separate from actually the
right does not exist for animals precisely because it has not developed animals do not have a history. So how can they possibly have this right if this right was not imminently developed in history itself? It's a right that we alone are affording recognition to
But
animals.
that would be a mistake to say that the right is a development of history. The right is a development of ontology that exists separate from us. Our understanding of right
But
is the development of
its
history.
development is through history. The ontological development of right occurs through the course of history itself.
The middle term, the self-consciousness itself, is the development of history. The understanding of consciousness is the development of history. Consciousness is the development of nature itself, and so is right.
Yes, but right, both right and nature for Hegel are reproduced in this development of history.
Exactly, which is why we constantly try to remove the separation between what we consider to be right and what we want to be right in terms of power dynamics in a master-slave relationship.
So this right is suspended in history itself, and whatever initial right human beings possessed, the insight into it is developed by history. But this insight is not some kind of individual enterprise in which we look at animals and, oh, this fits somewhere within the scheme. It's something that actually happens in history. This is what I'm trying to say. It actually does happen imminently. It's not because individuals like Sherlock Holmes discovered something.
I don't disagree. I think the value of genius in the Hegelian dialectic is nominal. Like they're just expressions of the spirit of the day. I don't disagree with that. What I'm saying is that the laws and fundamental notions of right, which we have developed, respective of the right which exists within nature, is constantly growing and is a mediation between us, what we think to be right and what is actually right. And so,
right, but what is actually right imposes its reality, not because it imposes its reality in an imminent way, is what I'm trying to say. It's not because
I would completely agree. I would completely agree with that.
It's not because we say this is right, but because I know you wouldn't like me using this word abstract, but because we arrive at it by some kind of abstract, conceptual, or even scientific investigation, we discover what is right through an imminent development of history itself. And I don't see veganism fitting within the scheme of that imminent development. I don't see any indications of it becoming a phenomena that can subsist outside of what Hegel would call the unhappy consciousness.
Okay, we'll call that an ending statement because we're going to move into audience questions. If you want to touch on this during the questions, you're welcome to, Lewis.
Yeah, that's right.
And in fact, since has had the last statement, I'm going to send the first question to you. This is from G. Nutt. Does perspective philosophy realize that animals are savage beings that rape and kill all the time? Why should humans apply ethics to them?
Yeah, I do realize that animals are savage beings that rape and kill all the time. Animals are horrible, man. Like, I don't know, some of them are. Animals can be vicious. What many would have considered natural evils almost. I mean, evil being an inappropriate term in a Hegelian sense, but there's lots of horrors in nature. I definitely understand that. But that doesn't mean that animals are not moral subjects or moral patients. It means that they cannot engage in a dialectical process. It means that an animal like a lion, when it mauls a human, hasn't denied the value of our experience for its own. It was unaware of our experience in a way which is meaningful and produces a notion of conscience, which is developing from this process of right. Instead, an animal is subject to its impulses and its drives. It is moved by them. It is a slave to nature, whilst we are not. In that, we can see that animals have drives and are conscious. They have value and wish to express those drives. They contain subjectivity. They simply do not own themselves and cannot express that subjectivity in a way that is capable of freedom in a Hegelian sense. An animal can never be free, but an animal is valuable. And for us to be free, we must respect that value and try to perpetuate their freedom as much as possible to give the greatest ontological foundation to our beliefs, to respect the middle term just as much, the first term just as much as the middle term within the dialectical process. And
this is for Haz from Heisenberg. This is a two-parter. How do you respond to a characterization of your argument as quote-unquote evolutionary colonialism? You recognize that apes/humans got there first by achieving self-consciousness, but you deny animals their quote-unquote right to evolve.
No, please don't let me deny animals' right to evolve. Please evolve, whatever that even means. I don't see what you're saying. How are we denying the right of animals? What do you mean evolutionary colonialism? We're stopping the cows from having a monarchy because we're eating them. I don't see how one follows.
I think achieving absolute spirit would be the question. But
yeah, I mean, to respond to that, animal consumption does not. First of all, animal consumption does not necessarily. First of all, here's why it's face value wrong. Because colonialism is not simply something that was condemned by virtue of the guilty conscience of colonizers. The colonial themselves rose up and overthrew those motherfuckers. So the day a cow and a goat can do that, be my guest, cows and goats, overthrow me just like, people in Africa were overthrowing the Spanish and the French and the British. Please do it if you can. But I don't think they're going to be doing that anytime soon. That's my response.
Yeah, I think you're going to eat those words someday. This is for Perspective Philosophy from Angelo Marni. How important is mutual recognition? Are animals capable of engaging in history?
I don't think animals are capable of engaging in history. At least, maybe not all of them. I guess it's possible that some would be capable of at least some forms of conceptual development. Some animals have been taught like somewhat primitive linguistic concepts and able to adhere to them. That doesn't mean that they would necessarily be attributable to a dialectical form. I don't think that's necessarily important. The development of history isn't a development that is meant to replace nature, but is meant to develop our understanding of nature and our understanding of right. It's not meant to replace right. The fundamental right that existed at the beginning of the dialectic when man was pre-linguistic or partially linguistic or becoming linguistic is the same right that is being expressed at the end of the dialectic. The truth doesn't change. It is fundamental. It is inherent within the ontology of being itself. What changes is our mediation with it.
Thank you. Also from Angelo Marni for Haz. Haz, how do you feel about post-humanism?
It depends on what you mean by that. I think a lot of the conceptions of humanism have thus far been straw men. I think I did have many disagreements with him, but I kind of sympathize with the neo-rationalists. I don't know if they still call themselves like Reza Negarstani and others who say that we have underestimated what human means thus far. Human does not mean the subject of humanitarianism, which is something recent. So I think we have underestimated what is the human thus far. And if we acquire an appreciation of the human, we will once again be allowed to recognize the significance of humanism as a historical phenomenon, which has been strawmanned in the modern age. And not the modern, but the 21st century.
Thank you very much. For Perspective Philosophy from Voidborn. Wouldn't it be a more grounded position to concede that animals are not equal to humans since they cannot form societies, so then humans being higher should be allowed to preserve animals?
Well, this is what it depends on what you consider the notion of equality. The notion of equality is not the power dynamic in terms of an individual's ability to, let's say, overthrow another. For example, the colonials that were overthrown and defeated by the natives, what they did was wrong, not because they were overthrown, but because of the reasons that they were overthrown and the development of that consciousness in.
But that's only proven when they're overthrown. The reasons are only proven in the act of overthrowing.
I would disagree. I would say that it develops within consciousness itself. The mediation between the individual and the other can happen without, let's say, a violent contestation.
But the point is,
Let Lewis finish, and then you're going to go. Okay.
Yeah, I would say that is necessarily the case. I would say that we know this in terms of there are many cultures that have been absolutely annihilated by other cultures, as in their consciousness and their spirit has been incapable of having the ethical growth which would necessarily give us the resistance necessary to develop it. The point of the matter is the ontological resistance of the will is what we become conscious of. That is what we become conscious of in terms of right. We see the resistance, we see the harm, we see the negativity in terms of consciousness and that contradiction, and we seek to resolve it within a new dynamic, which is what the overthrowing process is. The overthrowing process is not a development of a notion of this is now wrong. No, the slavery was wrong, and therefore we seek to cast off these chains.
Thank you. Okay, Haz, go.
yeah. Well, I wasn't aware we're still debating. He's like answering questions and also trying to respond and rebuke my previous points. So that's why
I just let you do that. But if you want to object, I'll give you a couple of minutes to do so.
Okay.
I'm sorry if I didn't mean to like cause a contestation there. I was just really
So in the case of the overthrowing, this is what you say you want to be the case in your head. But in real history, as far as real history is concerned, it is true that might is right. It is actually true. This is also true within the Hegelian scheme itself. How else does slave become slave and master become master? The reason why some kind of different result is produced from the master-slave dialectic isn't because some kind of guilty conscience on part of the master, but because of an imminent development that renders puts the slave in a position superior ultimately to the master. Now, regarding this business of entire cultures and peoples being annihilated, I would contest that this happens in a way that does not ultimately affect the imminent reality of the annihilating force in some kind of way. I think that the pretension of Europe and America to absolute power and colonial powers of absolute power is a bluff. They can't do it because doing so would fundamentally affect their own societies in a way they cannot afford. It's similar to the Israel kind of Gaza situation. Can the Israeli military go and do horrible things, eliminate Gaza? Yes, they can, but they can physically, yes, but they still can't. Not because it was determined ethically, but because the consequences would not be possible, both internally and obviously for the international scene. So this is what I mean. The act of overthrowing is what effectively proves, because we don't know before the fact, it is effectively what proves right and wrong.
Thank you.
I definitely disagree with that. I will say, I think that the proof of right and wrong is essentially established in the self-consciousness that is come to the conclusion that this action of control and domination was wrong.
Yeah,
but that development.
But that doesn't account for the contingencies of things like strategy and war, and all of those things for Hegel are not accidental contingencies. They figure within the deeper rationality of right and wrong, as you're putting it, or the will. So for Hegel, all of those contingencies are not accidents. The reason why, for example, Napoleon defeats Europe isn't simply because of contingent whatever. It's actually because this is, in a sense, right.
Well,
from the perspective of history.
I disagree. I think that what he would say, and I think an understanding of Hegel would lend itself to an understanding of ideological power and political power just as much as authoritarian power. So the direct opposition of the individual to a state or a body through physical force.
Yeah, but this distinction has not only does Hegel overcome this distinction in history. This distinction is overcome in like Maoist guerrilla war strategy or people's war, like. The ideology, for example, Marxism, Leninism, and its ability to strategically win, or let's say win the class struggle, these are one and the same thing. It's not like, oh, first you're right, then you win. No, you winning is proof that you're right. If you can't win, you're not right, so you have to win, basically.
Well, I would have said another thing. I would have said that I think it would be embodied really in the philosophy of someone like Martin Luther King and the developments that he managed to produce non-violently, but through an act of resistance. And the resistance itself and its demonstration to the world showed civil society the injustice that was going on and allowed for the development within civil society without acts of
Well,
bloodshed.
I'm more of a Malcolm X guy, so let's just leave it there. And that's like the difference between us, basically.
One question in terms of Mao, like in Maoist philosophy, do you not think that he's fundamentally wrong on his rejection of the negation of negation and falling into, I think, a form of particularity, and everything can be fundamentally and almost nominalism, really?
He has a one-sided dialectic of kind of almost either pure negation or this kind of pure reconciliation. I think Mao was both correct and incorrect. He was correct because his rejection of the prior conception of the negation allowed him to introduce the concept of infinity to the Marxist dialectic, which is coming from Chinese tradition and the Chinese philosophy. And this was an incredible achievement and innovation. Ultimately, negation of negation can be made compatible with Mao Zedong thought, but it must first take note of the achievements of Mao Zedong thought. But yes, he rejects the negation of the negation, but this is in a sense necessary for the time, and it's necessary for that time for him to do that.
Okay, thanks, guys. We're going to move on to the next question. I'm going to combine these two for Haz because they're relevant to each other. So this is from Voidburn and Noobslayer U. So question for Haz. Exceptions like cephalopods and dolphins have been able to express higher levels of self-awareness and thought. Why is it the fact that the species is what matters, but not the universality of consciousness itself that matters?
Because the universality of consciousness, as you're putting it, is a kind of, it's not what Hegel means. It's a kind of like New Age spiritualism thing. So when it comes to all of the newly observed things about dolphins and even apes, these still do not go beyond the bounds of what Hegel described animals in the philosophy of nature as being only acted upon by immediate and pure externalities. So the fact that different animals display different degrees of complexity still does not accomplish the necessary step toward entering history, entering itself. There's a qualitative difference that we're talking about here. That whatever, I know you maybe saw something about a dolphin that impressed you or an orangutan, but this is still not enough for them to be ethical subjects proper.
Thank you. Last question for Perspective Philosophy. This is from Angelo Marni. How do you justify imposing moral obligations on other people from a Hegelian perspective?
I don't. I don't think that you can impose a moral obligation or an ethical obligation, really, is what we should say, in the sense that I don't think that we can impose something that is outside of our society and the development of the concepts from which we share. Everything that I'm saying is conceptually available to you. You not only speak the same language, but mostly we're part of the same culture. Most of the people that watch my streams that are engaging in this have some shared ethical concepts, or the majority of which share the same ethical concepts. We share to the point in which we could develop laws which govern human behavior relative to each other and also to animals as well. I think that there are some societies which have not hit this point, and there are some individuals, some aspects of spirit which have not hit this point, and you can't force this progression. Hegel says moral progression is impossible, and I agree with that. But you can challenge it with rational argumentation and allow for the development of spirit to happen from external and internal critique. And this is a challenge to dogmatism itself, rather than a challenge to, rather than the imposition of a moral law upon an individual who would have no conceptual connection to it.
But doesn't this kind of contradict the Hegelian perspective, according to which, whereupon the insights of reason, so far as the individual is concerned, conflict with the deeper rationality of society and the world, so much worse for the individual's insights? It just reflects a narrow perspective. So how could arriving at some kind of conceptual insight on part of the individual, or rational insight on part of the individual, possibly have consequences for the society as a whole?
Oh, 100% must have. The whole point of the laws themselves are produced from the dialectical production, the dialectical engagement of subject and subject. There is no objectivity before that, and then the objectivity of the law imposed upon those individuals is the freedom of the individual from their own subjectivity and the elevation of their subjectivity or to the objective subject. And so that is their freedom. So like to say that like the difference is that this has to be reconciled within the consciousness of an individual. Hegel would see the abstract enactment of a law from which individuals did not have a conceptual understanding of as inherently wrong. He actually points out that laws from which individuals cannot understand, such as he points out a historical event in which they hammered the laws higher than anyone could see as being inherently unjustified, and it actually prevents an individual from engaging with the law. The law and punishment itself is meant to enact the subjectivity and maturity of the individual. And so the punishment of the individual when they breach the law is actually a reconciliation of that individual with society and themselves. We respect that they knew the law, they could understand the law, and that they chose to act otherwise to find their own subjectivity.
Yeah, obviously that's true, but that still doesn't address the point, which is if the law is the self-consciousness of the individual, then laws are not established because individuals come to insights in the way that you are coming to an insight here. Laws are established because of a combination of the contradiction between state and civil society, where it's harmony, the private interests, all sorts of different kinds of factors, which are more fundamental, particularity, passions, which are more fundamental than just the individual's conceptual use of reason.
But what they are is the individual elevated to the point of universality. It's a relationship, and philosophically between.
Yeah, but this comes. Yes.
Okay, hang on. Slow down. Perspective philosophy. Finish your thought, then has.
Okay, yeah, I'm just saying it's a relationship. It's a hermeneutic relationship between the individual themselves and the as an individual instancing of the universal principle. So the individual themselves is a necessary component in this. So a society which does not allow for the freedom of an individual and rejects the freedom of an individual would be inherently dogmatic and tyrannical and negative for Hegel.
Yes, I understand that laws elevate the self-conscious, but here's the thing. There's a reason why they have to exist in the estranged form of the law. And it's not just a matter of kind of a worldly convenience. It's the fact that this self-consciousness is greater than what can be afforded by the insights of individual reason alone. Now, the individual can be cognizant of the law, but even in being cognizant of the law, this will not fully satisfy the demands of the rational subject, insofar as they do not recognize the reality of a supra individual rationality that can often come at the expense of their expectations, prejudices, and beliefs, like a thief in the night, so to speak, like as an expression of a higher cunning.
I would agree. I would agree with that. I guess the only thing I would say is that
perspective. Just finish up really quickly because it has two more questions it needs to answer, and then we're going to wrap up.
Yeah, that's fine. I'll just say that essentially, that's true. The universality of reason is, essentially the driving force of what we must give ourselves into. We are subject to the laws. We cannot override them in the irony of the subjective, but that the laws are constitutive of subjects coming together, reasoning together, and putting forward their rational conclusions to produce the laws. The laws should be rationally attainable by everyone, and so follow what is testable and reliable to the understanding of an individual, and be produced from all of the individuals and the consideration of those individuals, and not produced by a class of individuals like a master-slave dialectic would give itself into.
But Hegel precisely disagrees when it is precisely produced by a kind of class of individuals, not democratically. It's the class of civil society.
Well,
it's the class of civil servant.
If you look at how Hegel's society works, it's almost like trifecta, isn't it? With the king sitting on the top. So you've got like you've got essentially civil society, civil society, individual interests or private interests, and then is it the king, or there's another institution I think that also mediates, but they're also all contradictory drives within society that are being mediated by the king. And
it's not democratic.
But the king himself is, and people argue about whether he was just essentially tipping his hat essentially to the king at the time because and for his own political interest, which I think he was, because the king himself has no subjective formulation. They are entirely objective. The king is purely the expression of the will of the people. The king would be replaceable with an AI. Not
necessarily. I mean, the king is inherited by tradition and custom, and there's a argument to be made for why Hegel was not necessarily just trying to circumvent censors and so on and so on. Obviously, the king doesn't have a lot of power, if basically to sum up what you were saying. But for Hegel, it's not like this kind of neo-Kantian, which is how I think you're describing it, this kind of neo-Kantian, social democratic kind of, we all get together and rationally decide an outcome in some kind of way. For Hegel, no, it's not. Hegel rejects this voluntarism, I think, almost explicitly in his form of the rejection of his critique of the English Reform Bill and his critique of the French Revolution and so on and so on.
Well,
okay, Lewis, final word, and then we're going to move on to the next question.
That's fair enough. I think that Hegel it wouldn't agree with something like a Marxist-Leninist state, I don't believe, or any sort of top-down sort of dictatorship. He may agree with the dictate of the proletariat, depending on...
Well, let's not get into this. Let's just...
That's fair. But I will say that Hegel does lend himself to, I would say, democracy in many ways, which is why a lot of, Hegelians are pro-democracy, myself included. I think that democracy is...
Analytic Hegelians like Brandom and Pippin, like the hardcore Hegelians, not so much.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you can go and read The Beginner's Guide to the Philosophy of Right, written by David Rose, who is more continental than I don't know, Swiss cheese.
His name sounds Anglo. Like, what about Kojève and people like that? Like real.
I'm not denying that there are people that do interpret Hegel in different
ways.
Hardcore
real Hegelians.
I think real Hegelians, continental Hegelians, can be liberals even. I think that is a bad stance to take. I'm not a liberal, but what I would say is that something like socialism and I would even say something like something close at even anarchism lends itself to Hegel in a way.
Let's debate about that another day. Jesus Christ.
Thank you very much, guys. Okay.
No, man.
All right, there's two final questions for you, and then we're going to wrap up. So the first is from Horizonberg. Could factory farming be a morally acceptable practice under socialism? If so, what conditions would need to be met for it to be acceptable?
Obviously, it could be morally acceptable. I don't see where morality has relevance here. Morality, if I'm a socialist, I'm a Marxist, right? So for Marx, this kind of estrangement of morality and ethics and religion from the actual material reproduction of society is a result of the division of labor. So for Marx, the new society kind of reconciles all of these things into determinate forms of labor and things like that. It's not like these are all, we approach things from is this morally correct? Is this religiously correct? For Marx, all of these things become reconciled. So is factory farming morally acceptable? Well, the doing away with factory farming would not be because of moral considerations, if that's your question. I think there are health considerations and things like that to be investigated, but from a moral perspective, I don't see why it's the problem.
Thank you. And final question for Haz. This is from Josh Hinoyosa. I take this to be a accusation of two fallacies, so I'll let you just respond to them. The first is name the trait. Also, you are appealing to nature and tradition fallacy.
I don't know what this name the trait stuff is from Ask Yourself. I think I'd already debated it. I debated someone from their server, and I talked about why this is not. I watched that debate. I don't know. I'll put it on.
Lewis is familiar with it. Does he want to give a quick explication?
Well, let me answer the second question first.
Please go for it.
I know what name the trait is. I know what name the trait is. I reject name the trait because it's undialectical. That's my summation. The real difference between mankind and animals is not because of some kind of arbitrarily formally intelligible trait. It's because of something suspended in actual reality. It's proven in a dialectic way, not because of some kind of axiom or dogma. The second thing was a question about appeal to nature and tradition. I didn't actually appeal to nature and tradition, if this is what you're saying. But that doesn't mean that traditions attest to a deeper rationality that requires one to possess an attitude of caution and more consideration. Like oftentimes when people critique traditions, they're taking a one-sided and very narrow perspective in relation to those same traditions. They're not actually understanding why those traditions have stood the test of time. And the reason is not because people are simply less intelligent than you are. That would assume that tradition. The reason I have problems with this as a logical fallacy is because it assumes that the products of the individual use of logic premise real human traditions. But what premises real human traditions is not the individual use of logic. What premises our traditions is ontological. It is our fundamental relationship to both our own being and nature and so on and so on. So I reject this kind of bullshit.
Thank you. All right. So that's it for questions. So thank you, gentlemen, for participating. If anyone, and thank you to the audience as well for your questions and for being extraordinarily civil, I greatly appreciate that. If you are a small content creator and you are interested in taking part in a future Sunday Showdown, DM me on Twitter or in the Discord server. If both of you would like to, I realize that I'm the smallest channel of the three of us here, but if you'd like to shout out your channels and say what you're about, please feel free. Haz, would you like to go first?
Yep, I'm on YouTube. It's the Infrared. Just search Infrared. You'll find me. I'm big enough for that now. Twitch.tv/Infrared Show. We're a Marxist-Leninist channel, but we're not just about politics. You know, I'm also a really entertaining person and really funny. And I'm also doing debates a lot, and it's entertaining, especially when I can get more than 2 hours of sleep. So yeah, come watch me.
I think for 2 hours of sleep, you did pretty damn well. Lewis, please.
Yeah, so hello, I'm Perspective Philosophy. You can find me at Perspective Philosophy on YouTube. I do debates like this one on philosophy, veganism, politics, ethics, and loads of other stuff, really. I do and longer form videos as well, even outlining ontological positions in ethics and other, philosophical positions. So yeah, just check us out. And my audience, check out President Sunday. And you know what? Actually, check out Infrared. Like that, this was actually pretty productive. I wasn't expecting that. So yeah.
Yeah, I agree. This is easily the most interesting discussion I've hosted so far. Granted, only the fourth, but I hope this portends the quality we'll be looking at in the future. Anyways, we're gonna call off now. So thank you very much, everybody, and take care.